The air inside the airport was thick with the usual pre-flight rush, rolling suitcases humming across the polished floor, the chatter of excited travelers, and the crisp voice of the overhead announcements echoing through the terminal. Among the sea of passengers making their way to their gate was the Carter family, a couple and their young daughter, all dressed in stylish yet comfortable attire, radiating the quiet confidence of seasoned travelers. They weren't the type to make a scene. They didn't have to. Their presence spoke for itself. As they approached the boarding area for their first-class seats, the flight attendant standing at the entrance barely glanced up from her tablet. Her name tag read Rebecca, and her expression was polite but distant, the kind of look that came with years of routine customer service. She scanned the boarding passes quickly, her eyes flickering with something unreadable as she looked at the family. Then, a pause. A hesitation that was almost imperceptible. Almost. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked, her tone carrying a forced politeness. Mr. Carter exchanged a brief glance with his wife, Ava, a silent conversation passing between them. "Yes," he responded, his voice calm but firm. "First class." Rebecca pursed her lips and let out a small breath. "Right," she said, dragging out the word. Another glance at the passes. Another pause. Then, she forced a smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Give me just a moment." She turned, stepping away to whisper something to another crew member. The hushed exchange was brief, but the side glances and the subtle shake of her head made it clear, something was off. By now, other first-class passengers had started boarding, breezing past without a second glance. But for the Carters, time seemed to slow. Their daughter, Mia, shifted on her feet, holding onto her mother's hand, sensing the unspoken tension in the air. Rebecca returned, her smile still plastered in place. "I'm so sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your seats." Ava straightened. "An issue?" "Yes, unfortunately, there's been." Rebecca hesitated, then gave a slight shrug as if the problem were beyond her control. "A reassignment. We'll need to move you to economy." Silence. Mr. Carter's jaw tensed, but his voice remained even. "That doesn't make sense. We booked these seats months ago." "I understand," Rebecca replied, but there was no real understanding in her tone. "It's just a mix-up with the system. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." Ava let out a slow breath, keeping her composure. "We're traveling with our daughter. We specifically booked first class for a reason." Rebecca's smile thinned. "I understand," she repeated, her patience waning. "But I'm afraid this is out of my hands." Mr. Carter studied her for a long moment, and for the first time, Rebecca shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. There was something in his demeanor, something powerful, unreadable, as if he were seeing right through her. Then, calmly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Who are you calling?" Rebecca asked, her polite facade cracking slightly. He lifted the phone to his ear. "The Airline." Rebecca blinked. The certainty in his tone, the way he said it so matter-of-factly, made her uneasy. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was something different about him, about them. Still, she stood firm. "I assure you, sir, there's nothing they can do." Mr. Carter didn't respond. He simply waited as the call connected. Seconds later, Rebecca's own radio crackled to life. A voice on the other end spoke urgently, and the color slowly drained from her face. Her gaze flicked back to the family, realization dawning too late. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career, and she had no idea who she was dealing with. Rebecca's throat felt dry as she adjusted the earpiece in her ear, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. The voice on the other end was firm, slightly rushed, but she only caught bits and pieces over the noise of passengers shuffling around. "Do not mistake. Immediate action." The static cut through the words, but something about the urgency in the tone sent a chill through her. She stole another glance at the man still holding the phone to his ear, his expression unreadable, his calmness unnerving. It wasn't the kind of calm that came from acceptance. No, this was something else. Ava, standing beside him, crossed her arms, her lips pressed together as if forcing herself to stay composed. Mia, their little girl, clutched her stuffed animal tighter, looking up at her mother, confused but quiet. She was old enough to know something wasn't right, but young enough to not fully understand what. Rebecca shifted on her feet. She had been in customer service for years, long enough to know when someone was about to cause a scene. And yet, despite the tension in the air, the Carters weren't raising their voices, weren't demanding anything, weren't even looking around for validation from other passengers. That made her more nervous. She cleared her throat, straightening her posture. "Sir, I really don't think calling the airline is necessary," she said, forcing a chuckle, hoping to regain control of the situation. "I promise you, we're just following protocol." Mr. Carter's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't rushing his words, wasn't reacting. He was just waiting. Rebecca's earpiece crackled again. This time, she heard the voice clearly. "Rebecca, step away from that family immediately." Her stomach twisted. She let out a small, shaky breath, but kept her voice steady. Copy that," she mumbled, keeping her radio pressed to her chest so the Carters wouldn't hear. The moment she took a half step back, she noticed something else. A man in a sharp suit appeared near the boarding gate, moving with purpose, his eyes locked onto the Carters. He wasn't security. He wasn't another flight attendant. And he didn't look like any of the first-class passengers. Rebecca's fingers curled tightly around her tablet. "Ma'am?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. It was another passenger, a middle-aged man in a blazer, looking annoyed. "We're boarding, right? What's the hold-up?" Rebecca's throat tightened. She swallowed and forced a smile, nodding toward the other flight attendant beside her. "Yes, of course, continue boarding," she said quickly, her voice slightly higher than before. The line resumed moving, but her mind was racing. The man in the suit was now standing just behind the Carters, his stance straight, his presence impossible to ignore. He leaned in slightly and whispered something to Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter gave the smallest nod. Rebecca's heart pounded. The suit-wearing man then turned toward her. "Excuse me, miss," he said smoothly, his voice even, controlled. "Would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" Rebecca hesitated. Now." Her breath hitched. There was no hostility in his voice, no raised tone, but the weight of that single word made her stomach drop. She nodded stiffly and took a few steps back, allowing another crew member to take over scanning the remaining passengers' tickets. The suit-wearing man motioned for her to follow him a few feet away from the gate, just far enough so they wouldn't be overheard. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice hushed. Who are they?" The man studied her, his gaze unreadable. Then, in a voice quiet enough that only she could hear, he said, "Do you have any idea who you just tried to remove from this flight?" Rebecca blinked. The man didn't wait for her to answer. "You just attempted to reassign seats belonging to the owners of this airline." A cold chill spread through her chest. Her mind blanked. She let out a nervous chuckle, shaking her head slightly. That can't be right." The man didn't smile, didn't blink. "Oh, it's right." Rebecca's breath quickened. I was just following the system. It must have made a mistake, The man tilted his head slightly, watching her unravel. "A mistake," he repeated. "That's interesting. Because it wasn't the system that singled them out, was it?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. She had nothing to say. The weight of the moment hit her all at once. Mr. Carter was still standing at the boarding gate, his phone no longer at his ear. But his eyes were on her now. Calm, steady, watching. She had misjudged them. She had assumed. And now, she was paying for it. The man in the suit took a step closer, lowering his voice even further. I suggest you think very carefully about what happens next. Rebecca swallowed hard, her pulse drumming in her ears. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was a career-ending mistake. And the worst part? She had no way to fix it. Rebecca's thoughts spiraled as she stood frozen, her hands gripping the tablet so tightly her knuckles turned white. The reality of her mistake was sinking in fast, but there was no way to undo what had already been set in motion. The Carters weren't just passengers. They weren't just another wealthy family. They were the owners, the people who decided who stayed and who left, and she had just tried to remove them from their own airline. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. The man in the suit, whoever he was, watched her carefully, his expression unreadable, as if waiting to see what she would do next. But Rebecca had no words, no excuse, just a deep, sinking regret that only grew as she risked another glance toward the family. Mr. Carter was still watching her, but it wasn't anger in his eyes. It wasn't even frustration. It was something worse, disappointment, like he had seen this happen before, like he had expected it. Ava gently rubbed Mia's back, whispering something in her ear to keep her calm, but there was no mistaking the tension in her stance. She had held back before, but now she was done waiting. She stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. I'd like to speak to the captain. Rebecca's stomach twisted. The captain. That was never a good sign. I don't think, she started, but Ava cut her off. No. Get the captain. The man in the suit gave Rebecca a look that made it clear. There was no arguing. Not anymore. Heart pounding, Rebecca turned and hurried toward the cockpit, every step feeling heavier than the last. She had worked this job long enough to know that when a first-class passenger demanded to speak with the captain, it usually meant trouble. When the owner of the airline demanded it, it meant the kind of trouble that could ruin careers. When she reached the door, she knocked twice, her throat dry. The door opened slightly, and Captain Hughes, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense attitude, peered out. What is it? He asked, his voice clipped. Rebecca hesitated, then swallowed hard. There's a situation with a passenger. His brows pulled together. What kind of situation? Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. The Carters. They'd like to speak with you. The captain's face darkened. He didn't say a word at first, just studied her, as if trying to piece together what had led to this. Then, without another question, he stepped past her, striding toward the boarding area. Rebecca followed, her heart hammering. By the time they reached the gate, the tension in the air had only thickened. Passengers in the background continued boarding, oblivious to the storm brewing at the front. Captain Hughes stepped in front of Mr. Carter, his expression unreadable. Mr. Carter, he greeted, his tone respectful but professional. Mr. Carter nodded once, but it was Ava who spoke first. Captain, we need to understand why our seats were reassigned. The captain's gaze flickered to Rebecca for the briefest second before returning to Ava. There must have been a mistake. Mistakes happen, Ava said, her voice even. But this one feels deliberate. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The captain exhaled, shifting slightly, as if weighing his words. I can assure you, Mrs. Carter, that we do not tolerate any form of— Then explain it to me, Ava interrupted, her eyes sharp. Because this isn't the first time. It's just the first time it's happening on our airline. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. The captain hesitated. I'll personally look into— No, Mr. Carter said, his voice calm but firm. You won't. I will. Silence. Rebecca's pulse pounded as she saw the captain's jaw tighten slightly. Mr. Carter wasn't raising his voice, wasn't making threats. But there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. He wasn't just another first-class passenger upset about an inconvenience. He was the one with the final say. For the first time, Rebecca truly understood the weight of the mistake she had made. The other flight attendants, sensing the shift in the situation, quietly busied themselves with last-minute preparations, avoiding eye contact. They had all seen minor disputes before, but this wasn't just another conflict. This was something bigger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the captain spoke. "I'll make sure your original seats are restored immediately." Ava didn't blink. "That's not the point." Captain Hughes nodded slowly. "I understand." The man in the suit, who had been silent up until now, took a step forward. "This conversation isn't over," he said, looking directly at Rebecca. "Not by a long shot." Rebecca's throat tightened. Mr. Carter sighed softly, then turned to Ava. "Let's get on board." Ava held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. With a glance at Rebecca, one that sent a chill through her, she took Mia's hand, and they stepped past the gate and onto the plane. Mr. Carter followed, leaving Rebecca standing there, her legs feeling like they might give out. The man in the suit lingered a moment longer, watching her. Then, without another word, he turned and followed them onto the aircraft. Rebecca let out a slow, shaky breath, but it did nothing to calm her racing heart. The Carters were on board. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the tablet, her mind spinning in circles. She could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Every step she took toward the aircraft felt heavier, like she was walking straight into the unknown. The Carters were on board, but that wasn't the end of it. No, this was just the beginning of something bigger, something she had no control over. As she stepped into the cabin, she forced herself to act normal, to keep her composure even as her stomach twisted with anxiety. The first-class section was quiet, but the air was thick with tension. Mr. Carter was seated now, his suit still crisp, his posture relaxed in a way that felt deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. Ava sat beside him, her arm resting on the armrest, fingers lightly tapping against it in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Mia was curled up against her mother, clutching her stuffed animal, her small eyes flickering between the adults as if sensing something unspoken. Rebecca avoided eye contact as she moved past them, pretending to check something on her screen even though her mind was barely functioning. She could feel their presence, their quiet but undeniable power, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. She took a steadying breath as she moved toward the service area, where the other flight attendants were gathered. She could see it in their faces. They all knew something was wrong. Some exchanged cautious glances, others whispered in hushed tones, but no one said it out loud. It didn't need to be said. She barely had time to process before the intercom crackled. The captain's voice was firm but measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are cleared for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and enjoy your flight." The cabin crew moved into position, going through the motions as if everything were normal, but nothing felt normal. Not to Rebecca. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, she glanced back toward first class. Mr. Carter wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking straight ahead, his fingers resting lightly against his phone, as if waiting for the right moment to make a call. Ava, however, was watching everything, taking in every detail, every movement, every reaction. Rebecca swallowed hard and turned away, gripping the edge of the service counter for support. The plane lifted off the ground, the familiar sensation pressing everyone back into their seats, but Rebecca's stomach remained twisted in knots. Minutes passed. The fastened seatbelt sign blinked off, and passengers began shifting in their seats, relaxing into the flight. But there was no relaxation for Rebecca. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from a drop she wouldn't recover from. And then it happened. Mr. Carter pressed the call button. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. For a second, she considered ignoring it, pretending another crew member would get to it first, but she knew that wasn't an option. This was her mess. She had to face it. She smoothed down her uniform, forced a polite smile, and walked back toward first class. Mr. Carter looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. Ava glanced at her husband, then back at Rebecca, waiting. "Yes, sir?" Rebecca asked, keeping her voice as steady as possible. Mr. Carter tilted his head slightly, considering her. "Could you get the captain for me?" Rebecca's pulse jumped. She hesitated, gripping her tablet a little tighter. "May I ask what this is regarding, sir?" Mr. Carter didn't blink. "You may. But I'd rather discuss it with the captain directly." Rebecca felt the sweat forming at the back of her neck. This was bad. Really bad. I'll let him know," she said quickly, turning before her voice could betray her any further. She hurried to the cockpit, her legs moving faster than she intended, her mind screaming at her to stay calm. She knocked once, then again, harder this time. The door cracked open, and Captain Hughes peered out. Rebecca swallowed. "Sir, Mr. Carter would like to speak with you." The captain studied her for a long moment before exhaling sharply. Without another word, he stepped out and made his way toward first class. Rebecca stayed back, but her eyes followed his every move. Passengers shifted in their seats, some glancing up as the captain passed by, sensing the unusual nature of the situation. When he reached Mr. Carter, he leaned down slightly, lowering his voice. "Mr. Carter, how can I assist you?" Rebecca couldn't hear the response, but she saw the way the captain stiffened slightly, his fingers tightening against the edge of the seat. Mr. Carter was speaking slowly, deliberately, his voice never rising, but whatever he was saying was landing with full impact. Ava sat beside him, completely composed, but there was something razor-sharp in her stillness. And then Mr. Carter did something that made Rebecca's blood run cold. He pulled out his phone. For the first time, his voice was loud enough for Rebecca to catch. "I think it's time we make some staffing adjustments," he said, tapping his screen. "Effective immediately." Rebecca's breath stopped. The captain's expression barely changed, but there was a shift, an unmistakable tension that rippled through him. And then he said the last thing Rebecca wanted to hear. "Yes, sir." "Understood." The air felt thick, suffocating. Ava's lips curled into the smallest smile, and Rebecca knew. Whatever was about to happen next, she wouldn't be walking away from it unscathed. Rebecca felt the world around her shrink. The sounds of the airplane, the hum of the engines, the quiet murmurs of passengers, the occasional chime from the intercom, faded into the background. All she could focus on was the way Captain Hughes nodded, his voice calm but final. "Yes, sir." "Understood." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She wasn't sure what exactly had just happened, but she knew, deep in her gut, that it wasn't good. Mr. Carter slid his phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Ava glanced at him, exchanging a look that was subtle but unmistakable. Whatever decision had been made, they were both in agreement. Rebecca swallowed, gripping the service counter for support as she watched the captain straighten up. He cleared his throat slightly, then turned on his heel and walked briskly toward the cockpit. He didn't even glance at her as he passed. Something was happening. Something big. Rebecca took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself, but the uneasy feeling in her stomach refused to go away. She had spent years working in the airline industry, and she had dealt with her fair share of difficult passengers. But this wasn't about a passenger anymore. This was about power, and she was on the wrong end of it. She was still processing when she heard the intercom crackle again. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Hughes' voice came through, steady but with an edge to it. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an unscheduled landing shortly. Please remain in your seats and await further instructions." Rebecca's breath caught. Unscheduled landing? Whispers spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances, some sitting up straighter, others pulling out their phones. A few turned toward the first-class section, where Mr. Carter sat completely unbothered, as if this was exactly what he had planned all along. Rebecca didn't have time to think before she felt a presence beside her. The man in the suit. She hadn't even seen him move, but now he was standing there, his gaze locked on her. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and firm. Rebecca's stomach twisted. I need to assist." "No," he cut her off. "You don't." The authority in his tone left no room for argument. Rebecca hesitated, her hands tightening at her sides. She had never felt this kind of tension before, not even in the most high-pressure situations. Something was happening behind the scenes, something far bigger than she had realized. And now, she was at the center of it. With a deep breath, she followed him toward the back of the aircraft, past curious passengers who pretended not to stare. Every step felt heavier, like she was walking toward something inevitable. When they reached the galley, the man turned to face her fully. His expression was unreadable, but there was something sharp in his eyes. "Do you understand what just happened?" he asked. Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it. She shook her head. "You made a mistake," he said simply. "And now, you're going to face the consequences." Her stomach flipped. I suggest you listen very carefully," he interrupted, "because whatever happens next is entirely up to them." Them. Rebecca's mouth went dry. Her mind raced, trying to grasp the full scope of the situation. This wasn't just about her being rude to a wealthy family. This wasn't even just about them owning the airline. This was something more. She could feel it now, the weight of an invisible force pressing down on her. And then, before she could say another word, the plane began to descend. Faster than it should have. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Where were they landing? And, more importantly, what was waiting for her when they did? Rebecca's breath came in short, uneven gasps as the plane descended faster than usual. Passengers looked around, some whispering in concern, while others clutched their armrests. She could see the anxiety spreading through the cabin, but no one knew the real reason behind this sudden change. No one except her. Her heart pounded as she stole a glance toward first class. Mr. Carter remained calm, completely at ease, his fingers tapping against the armrest. Ava leaned in slightly, whispering something in his ear, and he gave the smallest nod in response. Whatever was happening, it was still under their control. Rebecca swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. The man in the suit, who she now realized was more than just a bodyguard, stood close, watching her every move. His presence was a silent warning. A sharp ding from the intercom cut through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please remain seated." Rebecca's fingers curled into her palms. This wasn't a normal landing. The ground came into view through the windows, and she could just make out a private airstrip, far from any commercial airport. The plane touched down smoothly, gliding across the runway before coming to a slow stop. Outside, several black SUVs were already waiting, their tinted windows reflecting the aircraft's bright lights. A chill ran down Rebecca's spine. Passengers murmured in confusion, wondering where they were. Some pulled out their phones, only to frown when they realized they had no signal. The unease in the cabin grew, but no one had any real answers. Then, the voice of the captain came through again, sounding carefully measured. "Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." Rebecca's grip on the counter tightened. She wasn't sure what was coming next, but every instinct told her she was about to find out. The main cabin door opened, and a wave of warm night air rushed in. The Carters were the first to stand, moving with quiet confidence. The flight attendants, including Rebecca, stayed frozen in place, unsure whether to follow protocol or wait for instructions. And then, just as Mr. Carter was about to step out, he paused. Slowly, he turned back, his gaze settling on Rebecca. For a long moment, he didn't speak. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. Then finally, he said, "Come with us." Rebecca's stomach dropped. Passengers turned to look at her, some in confusion, others in curiosity. She hesitated, but the man in the suit took a small step forward, making it clear she didn't have a choice. With legs that felt like lead, she followed the Carters down the steps and onto the tarmac. The SUVs loomed ahead, their engines already running. She could hear the distant hum of the jet engines cooling behind her, but her mind was locked on what was in front of her. Ava opened the back door of one of the vehicles, stepping inside without a word. Mr. Carter lingered for a moment, then turned to face Rebecca directly. "You made a mistake today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I believe in second chances." Rebecca's throat went dry. We don't fire people for one bad decision," he continued, cutting her off. "We teach them, and we make sure they understand exactly what's at stake." She felt a shiver run through her spine. Was this some kind of test? Some lesson in humility? Before she could respond, Mr. Carter gestured toward the open SUV door. "Get in." Rebecca hesitated for only a second. Then, knowing she had no other option, she stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a quiet, final click. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night. And with it, Rebecca's old life faded into the distance, replaced by something entirely unexpected. The silence inside the SUV was heavy, pressing against Rebecca's chest as they drove away from the airstrip. She sat stiffly, her hands resting on her lap, trying not to let her nerves show. The tinted windows offered no view of where they were headed, and that only made the tension worse. Ava sat beside her, composed as ever, scrolling through her phone like this was just another routine ride. Mr. Carter sat across from them, his eyes fixed on Rebecca, studying her. The quiet hum of the engine filled the space, but no one spoke. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the vehicle finally slowed. Rebecca felt the subtle dip as they turned onto a smoother road, then a gentle stop. The locks clicked open, and before she could react, the man in the suit stepped out and held the door open for her. Rebecca hesitated only a second before stepping out onto a perfectly paved driveway. The air smelled crisp, carrying the distant scent of trees. In front of her stood a modern sprawling estate, its glass walls reflecting the soft glow of outdoor lights. It was the kind of place she had only ever seen in magazines. Ava and Mr. Carter exited behind her, moving with the same quiet confidence. The front doors opened before they even reached them, as if someone had been expecting them. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she followed them inside, the interior just as grand as she had imagined. Polished marble floors, high ceilings, and an atmosphere of quiet luxury. She didn't know where to stand, what to say, or even what she was doing here. Mr. Carter gestured toward a sitting area, and Rebecca obeyed, lowering herself onto a sleek leather chair. Ava sat down gracefully across from her, crossing one leg over the other. Mr. Carter remained standing for a moment before finally speaking. "I'm not a man who believes in making enemies over small mistakes," he said, his voice calm. "But I do believe in lessons." Rebecca nodded slightly, unsure if she should respond. "You judged us," Ava added, her tone softer but no less firm. "Without knowing who we were, without considering anything beyond what you assumed." Rebecca swallowed hard. "I know," she admitted, "and I regret it." Mr. Carter tilted his head slightly, considering her words. Then, after a moment, he walked over to a nearby desk and picked up a file. He flipped it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper before placing it on the table between them. Rebecca's eyes darted to it. The paper bore the airline's logo, an official company document. She leaned forward slightly, scanning the words. Her breath caught. It wasn't a termination letter. It was a contract. Her eyes snapped up to Mr. Carter's, filled with confusion. "I own this airline," he said, "but I don't just sit in boardrooms all day. I pay attention. I look for people who have potential but need a wake-up call." Rebecca's fingers tightened on the edge of her seat. "What does this mean?" Ava smiled slightly. It means we're offering you a second chance, she said. But not as a flight attendant. Rebecca's heart pounded. Then as what? Mr. Carter sat down across from her, folding his hands. Management training. You'd learn the business from the inside out. How things really work, beyond just what happens in the cabin. Rebecca's head spun. She had never expected this. This is a test, isn't it? She asked cautiously. Ava's lips curled into a knowing smile. Everything in life is a test. Rebecca exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Just hours ago, she thought she was going to be fired, maybe even blacklisted from the industry. Now, she was being offered a position she never even dared to dream about. She looked at the contract again, then back at the Carters. I don't understand, she admitted. Why me? Mr. Carter leaned back. Because you made a mistake, he said simply. And we wanted to see how you'd handle it. Rebecca let his words sink in. They had been watching her, testing her, and now they were giving her a chance to prove herself. She took a deep breath and picked up the contract, scanning the terms. It was a fair offer. Better than fair, actually. It was an opportunity that could change the entire course of her career. She glanced up once more. If I say yes, what happens next? Ava smiled. Then you start tomorrow. Rebecca hesitated only a second longer before she picked up the pen. And as she signed her name on the dotted line, she realized something. This wasn't just a second chance. It was the beginning of something entirely new.